I'd like to bring the joint meeting of the Planning Commission and the Economic Development Authority to order. Erin, would you please call the roll? Heather, would you please call the roll for the Planning Commission?
Mr. Boswell?
Here.
Mr. Klee?
Here.
Ms. Macbeth?
Here.
Mr. Edwards?
Here.
Mr. Schaller?
Here.
Mr. Rogers?
Here.
Mr. Granger?
Here. Heather, could I ask you to call the roll for the Economic Development Authority?
Mr. Steele?
Here.
Mr. Overy? Trichler?
Here.
Mr. Kale?
Here.
Mr. Carr?
Here.
Ms. Hahn? Mr. Wiley?
Okay, well, thank you for everyone who's here. Our main body of business is the presentation of the 2019 Economic Development Strategic Plan, and I think that Michelle will be introducing our speaker.
Yes. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm delighted to introduce Crystal Morphus, who's been working on our Economic Development Plan for 2019. We're delighted to work with her. Crystal started her career in North Carolina with Surrey County, and then worked with Sanford Holhauser, which is two governors, I think, of North Carolina, where she was a consultant. And then in 2012, branched off and started her own consulting firm. So I've known Crystal for many years and am so delighted to finally be working with her on this project. I think you're going to really enjoy the presentation. It builds on what we've said our economic development goals were for the past 12, 13 years. Those 5 goals, and then it talks about targeting businesses that help us meet those goals and help diversify the economy and some strategies for doing that. So hopefully you enjoyed looking through the plan, and Crystal will go over it. And she said she'll say this, I'm sure, but she's happy to take questions and comments throughout the presentation.
Michelle, I am glad to be with you, and please ask questions along the way rather than me talking at you for a period of time. I'll also pause throughout just to ask if there are any questions so we can have a good dialogue. The purpose of today's presentation is to get input and feedback from the Planning Commission and the EDA. We consider the report to be in a final draft state right now. And after today's input and feedback, we will go back to this draft report, make any revisions, changes, and do any additional research that we need to do to finalize that report and then bring forward a final report. So I look forward to having a good dialogue with you. I'll lead off by saying I have enjoyed working with your economic development team and with your EDA. You have a very qualified, experienced, and passionate staff. They are good ambassadors and spokespeople for Williamsburg and have been very helpful to us throughout this process. So we have enjoyed very much working with them. Michelle did lead off and say that this study does align with your economic development goals from your previous plan and your biennial goals of the city. And I just want to make a couple of comments about that. We wanted to make sure that we were in alignment, revisiting those goals and reinforcing them. The first one is about existing business. Williamsburg does have a strong, especially small business base, so you will see strategies to support small business development and growth in the community. The goals also talk about diversification. When we talk about target sectors and attracting new companies, diversification is a primary goal there. We also talk about positive business climate. That's very important, the business climate environment, and how this strategic plan, this economic development plan, can support the business climate. Infrastructure, we use the term strategic public investments in infrastructure, and we talk about some of the public investments that are needed to support these economic development goals. And the fifth one has to do with sense of place, and placemaking is a relatively new term in economic development, but it's an old concept. But it's really important today because one of our primary drivers is workforce and talented people gravitate to places, unique and wonderful places, which this is. But keeping that in focus and making those strategic investments for placemaking is very important. One of our first steps was to identify target industry sectors. This is important because it allows you to focus your resources for business recruitment and development. It does not mean that other sectors are not welcome in Williamsburg or you will not support other sectors. It's just how are you going to focus the limited resources and staff capacity that you have. The first sector is tourism. And let me back up and say how we got to these. We did economic and demographic research to look at trends, not only in Williamsburg, but in York County, James City County, Hampton Roads region, to see how you were growing and changing. We looked at business sector growth, what sectors are growing, which ones are declining. We looked at what's called location quotient, which is the concentration of these sectors in the economy, and also the assets that you have to support these target sectors. So the first one is no surprise to you. It's tourism and hospitality. It's a cornerstone of the Williamsburg economy. It has been and will continue to be. And so it's an obvious one to continue to build upon and to grow and develop in the future. The second is professional and technical services. So you can think accounting firms, engineering firms, IT consulting, graphic design. This sector, for example, could support industries and businesses in the region, like from the Richmond area, for example. It also draws on the talent that comes out of William and Mary. Same thing for business support services. You can think of sectors like data processing, business service centers, and education support services is lumped under that title. And again, outside of tourism and hospitality, the other, of course, large employer is William and Mary. And this is really where that comes from, to support William and Mary, the education services, and a lot of the students that come out would be ideal candidates to work in this sector. Then health services is growing all across the country. It's growing in this community. You've seen some key investments from healthcare companies, and that's another target. So before I get to the value proposition, which is next, I'll just pause here to see if there are any questions about the target sectors. Okay, we can always come back to this as we go forward in the plan. The next charge for us was to look at the value proposition for Williamsburg. And the value proposition is what you use in marketing. It's how you position your community for business recruitment and business development. And I'll talk about these 7 areas in a little bit more detail. It's very important to note that you have a growing population. A lot of, especially small and mid-sized communities across Virginia and other places, have either stagnant or declining population growth. So it's very important because it shows a future pipeline of workers and of people coming to your community. You also have this higher concentration of young people. That's very important. Millennials make up the largest part of the workforce. There's this huge demographic shift going on. You probably know that 10,000 baby boomers are retiring every day. And to have this concentration of young people is really important. Companies will look to this as a future talent pipeline. And also that higher percentage of veterans is very important as well to economic development. Veterans are very used to being trained and retrained through their service, and so they make ideal employees. And under that talent, if you look at the total labor shed, it's about 1.3 million people. So sometimes you may think of Williamsburg as a smaller city or smaller community, but really you have this huge labor shed to draw from, which is a tremendous asset. The commuters, again, is another asset, and this unemployment rate, which is important to the community to have a low unemployment rate. Really, that one is not as big of an asset. When you get an unemployment rate that low, it's very hard to attract workers. But compared to other places, it's not outside of the average of what we're seeing in other communities. Continuing on that path of workforce and talent, you're also very educated, as you know, with higher degrees, higher percentages of higher degreed people in your community. This is a very important thing to tout to companies. Again, it relates to that talented workforce. You can talk about the enrollment at William and Mary, and especially the graduate student enrollment, the business administration program, the legal program. Those are all tremendous assets. And then we list several training institutions. So when I started in economic development more than 20 years ago, we always talked about the 3 L's being location, 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 the realtor's mantra. Today, the 3 L's are labor, labor, labor. It's about where can I find people, talented and skilled people to work for me. And so this really important part of the value proposition and to incorporate this in your marketing material. Another important part of the value proposition is the entrepreneurial base here in Williamsburg. You have a huge percentage of companies that have less than 100 employees, 98%. And if you look at that, more than a third have less than 5 employees. So as we get to small business and entrepreneur development, there's some specific strategies for that. It's a really important base for Williamsburg. And then several transportation assets, of course, highway, air, as well as ports and other access here is very important. So I'll pause there on the value proposition before we get into goals and strategies to see if you have any questions or comments on that.
Did you look, or do you have any background information at all about the impact of airline flights in and out of the area? I sat in another meeting recently where the lack of diversity of flights in and out of Patrick Henry Field counted as a negative because it was very hard to get in and out of it. You had to go to Richmond.
We have not, but that's a really good point. But I'll make a note to go back and look at that. From my memory, it did not come up in our business interviews, but I don't know that we specifically asked about it. Thank you for that.
I had a question on the industry diversification. So I know in some of the slides in the text, we're not really diversified. We're highly leveraged in a couple key industries. I was wondering, for towns of Williamsburg size, is that abnormal? I know compared to the full range of the data set, we're skewed, but in terms of Williamsburg side, in particular, looking at higher, more developed industries, some of the engineering kind of clusters, or how atypical are we in terms of our leverage? You're
very atypical. You're very unique. I cannot think, and again, I've been doing this for a long time in a lot of places, and the colleague who worked a lot on the data side of it, she's been doing it for about 25 years and doing data research in communities. It's very unusual to find a community like yours that has these 2 large employers and then everyone else in terms of size. It's very unusual to have that concentration. But I have worked in places before that have a high concentration in stable industries. So, for example, I've worked in communities that have a university, a large healthcare facility, and a military base, let's say. There's still a lot of other diverse industries in there, but that provides a lot of stability to the economy. I think that's something that you've enjoyed here in general. The college has been very stable, and that's helped your economy. And Colonial Williamsburg, being a top destination, even when tourism is down across the country, you're still one of the leading destinations. You may not feel that as much as other tourism communities. So there's a little stability there, but yeah, there's a lot of difference. So diversification is important. That's why the professional and technical services, the business services, and healthcare diversify you away from those 2. They're still very important. But I think back to, for example, when I was a practicing economic developer, I worked in a community that was heavily in textiles at the time. We had so many eggs in one basket that when that industry took a nosedive, we were very much in turmoil. Yeah, but you're very unique.
So while we're a company town, we have enough diversification that we're not going to take a nosedive, is how I interpret what you just said.
You have some. So for example, if instead of the university, you had that level of employment in one corporate entity, I would be more nervous. The university is much more stable than a general corporate entity. And tourism, of course, has a lot of flux with the economy, but considering that you are one of the top destinations in the country, I don't think you have as much variation as others do. So let's talk about goals and strategies. The first one is about those target sectors and strengthening them. So we like to say in target sector and support, there are really 3 legs to the stool. The first is talent, and that will be on the next slide. The second is supply chain, and we do have recommendations to identify the supply chain for these sectors. And the third is to work on centers of innovation and excellence in your community that support growth and development of the cluster. That first bullet about cluster networking and development is important. Companies like to synergize with like companies, but then also companies that can spark new ideas outside of their field. So we recommended some cluster meetings and cluster summits to bring your companies together in similar clusters, and also to work on that supply chain that can help them, for example, reduce costs with the supply chain. And then on the centers of innovation, for example, especially with the college, to catalog those centers of innovation that are already there, for example, with the business school is one. But then for those areas that don't have a center of innovation, start working on those. So for example, in retail and tourism-related businesses, there's high turnover, both in terms of business closure and startups, but also in employee turnover. And there are some strategies to address that, for example, with innovation and a center of excellence to help them with more stability in that sector. So I mentioned the second leg of the stool is talent, and for supply chain talent and centers of excellence. For talent, to expose students to the careers in the targeted sectors and mapping those career pathways. Some of them would be pretty obvious, like in some business services or technical services, but what is the career pathway for someone to work in tourism and hospitality? What is a pathway, for example, to entrepreneurship in opening a small business in the community, and helping map that career pathway so students can see how they can be a part of these sectors in Williamsburg. And connect college students more to Williamsburg. Where students intern, they are more likely to stay. So help supporting internship programs and helping businesses understand how to start an internship will help connect those students to the community. Then reconnecting alumni. Your program already does a good job with supporting alumni events, but through social media and other outreach, helping alumni know that this is a good place to bring their business back to start a business. Of course, you want them to relocate back to Williamsburg if they've moved off. And then support businesses that have trailing spouses. This is something we specifically heard in interviews. For example, if someone moves to work at William & Mary or moves to work in engineering or something here, they have a concern about whether their spouse can find employment. So we have a couple of recommendations of networking, welcoming packets, and other ways to integrate trailing spouses in the community. You may be able to get some ideas from military-based communities. We've done a lot of research on military spouses and dependent employment, for example, and some of those strategies might apply here, because if you can find employment for their spouse, then they're more likely to live in this area versus living somewhere else and commuting in. So I'll stop and ask if there are any questions there with the clusters and the talent before I move on to marketing.
I apologize, this may be a naive question, but just so I understand the terminology, in my field, strategy means in ways and means all co-located, so it means there's resources available to pursue each of the strategies. Is this the case here? I'm looking at staff. Do we have resources already aligned for each of these, or are these more notional possible paths based on our brainstorming session later on? Are you looking for guidance on which to prioritize in the timing sequence? Or are the resources aligned with these?
Actually, I believe Crystal plans to address that later in the presentation.
Well, yeah.
I did see the implementation calendar, but I guess my question is, do we have resources to do a 3-year implementation of all these ideas, or are we looking to prioritize which ones we think are most beneficial?
The latter. We do not have resources to do all these immediately. So prioritization is one tool, also looking for more resources to do things that we prioritize as well.
I am not surprised, but also I was hoping for a resource, a gift from the heavens. But okay, that's helpful to think through these.
We'll talk about resources. It's very important to really talk about resources in terms of money, but also just staff capacity, because you do have a small staff for the things you'd like to accomplish. So if we have these target sectors, we've laid out a marketing strategy for those target sectors. I won't go through each one of these, but with target sectors, you can think of it like in your business, you would welcome any customer that walks in the door, but you have to identify your target audience and a marketing strategy for that target audience so that you can focus your limited resources in marketing. So we've laid out an email program, what we call lead generation program, where you can do that in-house or you can contract with other firms to help you generate leads for business recruitment. You also have your regional partner that helps you with external marketing and scheduling sales trips and meetings with site consultants, and you do a great job in interacting with the EDP and leads that they have. But don't overlook internal marketing as well. Internal marketing is very important in the community. Each one of you is an ambassador for Williamsburg. When I checked into the hotel, the front desk staff is an ambassador for Williamsburg. So don't overlook the importance of that internal message. One of the things we say in economic development is tell your story and tell it so often that others tell it for you, and that's really important in economic development. So we do lay out this external marketing program, but we also talk about internal marketing as well. So all business has to have a place to go. They have to have a place to call home. Whether you are a one-person shop hoping to be much larger and want co-work space, or whether you are attracting an accounting office that has, let's say, 20 or 25 employees, they need a large office. You need sites ready for tourism, companies that want to come to this community. You need sites for healthcare, for example. So we've talked about several different areas that you need to focus on in what we call product development and economic development, all the way from office space, again, small up to larger. And you do have a couple of co-work spaces here, so we talk about activating those spaces, encouraging more private investment in those spaces, and ensuring that they're successful. Because if private investment is successful, then it will continue to expand and grow. But one of the things that we want to make sure is you have space for larger offices. In looking at your inventory, there's a lot of office space that's really small. But if you're going to recruit a medium-sized engineering firm, for example, it might be hard for them to find office space. Same thing with healthcare. Do you have sites ready for healthcare companies? And we talk about an arts collaborative. Williamsburg is an artistic community. There are good examples of artist space, both incubator and accelerator space for artists. Have any of you been to the space in Abingdon, Virginia? You have, yes, it's an old elementary school, and if you can envision, each classroom is an artist space where you can interact with the artist, you can buy their art, and there's shared gallery space. But you can think about spaces like that in your community that would support artists. And then we talk about a retail incubator concept. Retail has a high business closure rate and turnover rate. It's important to you as a tourism economy that when someone comes to Williamsburg and they have a wonderful experience, when they come back next year, they want to repeat that experience. And if there's a constant churning of the places they visited, they can't recreate that experience. So, for example, a retail incubator, for example, a kiosk space, but also provides them management and support and development support so that when they graduate out of that space into their own shop, they have a more sound footing than if they had started from scratch. So it's a way to mentor them and help grow them. I've mentioned small business and entrepreneurs several times. It is very important that Williamsburg focus on the entrepreneur and the small business person. That is the core of your business base. It will continue to be the core of your business base. So we talk about how to make it easier to open a business and to market that the Economic Development Office is a small business concierge and has that service, for example. I'm a small business person. One of my big frustrations is the bureaucracy and the regulatory process when I either try to change or do something different, or when I try to start my business, for example. So when I go to one city department, I get one answer. When I go to another department, I get another answer. I don't realize I need this permit, and it's kind of difficult. When you have a small business liaison or concierge service at the city, it's almost like a handhold, walk you through. You have a single point of contact to help you solve problems as a small business person. And so that concierge service can do that. We also talk about creating and marketing starter kits, how to start a restaurant in Williamsburg, how to start your gallery in Williamsburg, how to start this and start that. And that's a good way to promote entrepreneurship on the website, but it also gives people some basic information. And I'll say your website has a lot of information on it that's very good for business, but pulling that together in more of a seamless approach, I think would be helpful to business people. Then we have a section in the report that talks about supporting women, minority, and young entrepreneurs. Women and minority business owners, they start businesses at a higher rate than other people. Immigrants do as well. So ensuring that your small business center has programs and services to support them and to get those designations. For example, we're a SWAM business in Virginia, so we get that designation, and sometimes that can give you an advantage in contracting. I'll stop there before the last two slides to see if there are any questions. I'll go on and say something about incentives. We want to make sure that your incentive policy aligns with target clusters. So, for example, office projects do not have typically a lot of taxable real property investment, but we would ask you to consider the other impacts of those projects. So, for example, you can run econometric modeling programs like M-Plan, or it can be run through a program the office already has, Jobs EQ, to consider indirect and induced impacts into the community as well, just not direct revenue impacts when you're considering incentives for office projects. And I will say that this is not unique to Williamsburg or even Virginia. This happens in many states. Most states' incentive programs are based on direct tax revenue from real property, machinery, and equipment. Office projects typically don't have as much of that, but they usually have well-paying jobs with good benefits. So you want to attract them to the community, and so you have to look at your incentive policy usually a different way. To ensure your incentive policy is open and supportive of large tourism projects. So even though you have Colonial Williamsburg, amusement park, and other things, what are other destination tourism projects that you could encourage to come here? And then also to encourage healthcare-related businesses, and that would be for-profit healthcare-related. We know that many are nonprofit, but there are more and more for-profit imaging centers and other things that are opening up, and just ensure your incentive policy will address those companies as well. And then to the members' point there, resources. We do recommend a phased implementation as resources are available, and to look at future funding increases to the EDA. In the short term, for example, they could use additional funding for contract services, for example, some of the things that we talked about in marketing. Eventually, over time, additional resources and staff capacity should be evaluated to fully implement the strategic plan. But of course, it's meant to be implemented over multiple years, 5 years, or in some cases more with product development. And there's some low-hanging fruit that you can accomplish, of course, in the first year with some resources you already have. But for full implementation, you should look in the future to additional resources for the economic development program. And there's the implementation schedule. It just outlines some, again, low-hanging fruit, some mid-range goals, long-term, and then some ongoing things that are just become part of the economic development program. Some of them already are, like meeting with VEDP and familiarization tours for economic development allies in the community. So there's the short-term, medium-term, long-term, and then ongoing as well. So with that, I will be glad to answer any questions, but more importantly, to get your feedback, and so that we can work to finalize this plan. Yes?
The implementation. Right now, when we do tax-based incentives or any other programs which encourage economic development, revenues go back into the general pool and are reallocated however the City Council feels necessary. How do other localities track the success of the programs they're doing? And some EDAs actually have the revenue come back to the EDA, and then it can be respent to encourage more. Where are we on that scale, and how would we, what other best practices would be available to create more resources through the successful implementation of these recommendations?
One of the best practices that we do favor is some economic development programs have a policy where a percentage of net new revenue from projects that they have been involved and supported goes into an economic development fund. And it's structured different ways in different states, but it's performance-based. The more successful the economic development program is, more tax revenue comes back, and some percentage of that is designated to economic development. In some cases, that designated fund goes to infrastructure. Sometimes it goes to special capacity building projects for economic development. And there are some cases that a portion of it will fund some operations, for example. But typically it's a fund that will build up and then support larger goals and projects over time.
I have a question for you about the William & Mary alumni outreach and the sort of the town and gown. Do you have an example or two of similar communities that have implemented that sort of thing from the community side? I mean, obviously William & Mary has a very robust alumni outreach program already. What have cities done to sort of work with that and synergize?
One of the good examples, and I encourage you to reach out to them, it's not a city, but the Onward New River Valley, in Blacksburg and Virginia Tech have a really good relationship. They have done similar things to you, which is to participate in homecoming weekends, to set up booths. Other places travel to where there are concentrations of alumni, for example, for certain events, alumni recruitment events. But I would look into the Onward NRV and the Blacksburg approach with Virginia Tech. I think they've done a pretty good job with that in terms of an economic development organization incorporating it into their marketing program. But that's a key strategy. People have a connection to Williamsburg when they're here. So getting them involved in an internship would connect them with the business community so they have another tie, and then encouraging them to come back. You know, part of it is social media, making them aware of how Williamsburg has changed over time. They may not consider it as a place for their business when they're 45, but engaging with them through the alumni network and social media may open their eyes to a business opportunity here. But I'd look into Blacksburg and Virginia Tech. Yes.
So thank you very much for coming to speak with us today. I have a very similarly related implementation comment. So from a supply and demand perspective, you talk about the 3 L's and how they've changed from location, location, location to labor instead. And so for the way I see it is that there's a high demand in business recruitment from having that labor force already here. But paradoxically almost, there's also a high supply side of the thousands of students graduating every year, except they then go to different places. And so I loved the fact that there was a how to start an internship brochure idea, because I know that our entrepreneurship center is very, very active in the business school, especially with students actually outside of the business school major in physics, English, whatever. There's many, many students involved. I did see, though, that it was listed under the year 4 and 5, but to me it actually seems a bit like a low-hanging fruit, and I would recommend it bringing it to year 1 and how to start an internship, because from the student perspective, wrongly in my opinion, Williamsburg is not seen as an entrepreneurial city, but I know that the Entrepreneurship Center, maybe in just one talk from a small company here in Williamsburg, could quickly change that perspective and really get students considering at least working unpaid during the school year here, or perhaps staying after graduation. So I would recommend moving that to year 1.
Good, thank you for that. Just a couple of other thoughts. It was not in this report, but we have worked in communities that have what they call, instead of intern, intranet summer. Okay. So, for example, this would be someone that went to high school in this area, but didn't go to William & Mary. They went off somewhere. But you arrange an online portal that allows them to have an internship while they're home during the summer in Williamsburg, and that gives students that have left for university somewhere else a connection back to this community. And then just as an aside, in terms of high school connection, I love the program in Giles County. Their community has vetted about, let's say, 75 employers, and the county will pay half the wages of high school students to work at those companies during the summer. So it allows high school students to get entrenched with local companies and to get work experience. And the companies have exposure to the school system, and they're in partnership with the county, but the county pays half the summer wage for the student. It's a really neat program to get high school students connected to companies.
Absolutely, and there's plenty of high schools around, too, that could also be involved in this
I like
how to start an
program.
internship, for sure.
So I also want to say thank you for the report. I think these are useful because they help to standardize and solidify some of the thinking, and it's helpful to then leap onto other thoughts. And I think there's 2 observations, and picking back on Caleb a bit, but first, it's been fun to see students who graduated 5 or 6 years ago come back for homecoming, and we chat about how their life is in D.C., and they say, you know, it's funny, I never imagined myself coming back to Williamsburg, but seeing how things have been changing downtown, I can now imagine myself moving back as soon as I have a kid, right? As long as there's a job for me, I can see myself moving back. So I think there's some encouraging just anecdotes of how things are seeming to change for the William & Mary community, which is, again, our greatest export. 2,000 people every year who go off to really high-paying jobs, the most part are very successful. So thinking about this connection, I'm really intrigued. And I'm actually interested in, I think Caleb's onto something really interesting with the Entrepreneurship Center. And one of my questions for maybe staff and for yourself is, when I think about limited resources, sometimes I think about what are the forcing events in the upcoming year that are helpful for us to gain momentum, that are already moving, that we can build on or amplify. And I think the city did a really nice job with Midtown recently of making way for that in the planning process to take advantage of opportunity. There's so much on entrepreneurship in your study, and I was struck by the 1/3 of businesses under 5. I believe the Entrepreneurship Center, William & Mary, may be moving off-site. So I don't know how much this is formal, how much I've heard is scuttlebutt. So I don't want to commit staff to anything that's not ready. But if the William & Mary is moving entrepreneurship off campus into the community, and if there's things changing with the Launchpad as well, and if this is our target population, it seems to me there may be a window in the upcoming year, 18 months, to really lean into the population that we currently have. And I also think the tail for some of these things, for students at least, is 10, 15 years. So if we want to be visionary and think forward, how do you get students engaged with entrepreneurship, helping businesses here get a taste of the community, and hopefully in 10, 15 years, they come back? And how do we start encouraging that? So that's my 2 cents where I really like where Caleb went with this entrepreneurship idea. It stood out to me reported in a way that was not as clear to me before. And there may be movement at William & Mary to help amplify some of our efforts. So I'd be curious if there's a follow-up, if there's something to explore further there and see what might be possible.
Let me just add to Mr. Trischler's point. The Entrepreneur Center has an open house this evening at 7 o'clock. If anybody would like to go, volunteers will be taken and refreshments will be served.
Elaine, I got a question.
Take a broad view of entrepreneurship and all the ways you can be involved. It really starts almost in elementary school and middle school with entrepreneurship programs and innovative thinking programs that there are even some middle schools, for example, that have entrepreneurship integrated into curriculum in different ways so that young people see that there is an opportunity to own your own business. And so that can go through high school. There are some high schools where high school students actually run businesses within the high school. I read about one where the students ran a bank where you could get a loan, you had to go buy a phone or whatever. But they can run. So that starts there, and then it goes on through university, for example, and the programs that you have, and then to encourage people who are working, and then people who are mid-career, for example. So I think about it in that whole continuum in terms of entrepreneurship. But we'll talk, and I think you have a good insight there that there may be a window of opportunity for some synergistic things that are happening in the near term that we should take advantage of.
For Crystal and Elaine, I think I'm having a challenge because we tend to look in our EDA meetings through the lens of economic development at all of these policies and procedures. And so, because we're sitting here together,
right,
my thought is, how do we take advantage of the expertise and the lens of your group to look at these same challenges and make strategic longer range plans the way you look at problems as opposed to more case by case opportunistic way that economic development has to act.
Right. And so as I usually try to, sort of sit on my hands and let people talk before I sort of start talking, but where I wanted to go was directly in that direction, because for us, well, first off, I really appreciate your report and all the different, appendices and all that kind of stuff, the dots and all those things. Very fun looking through that. But for us, we're in our comprehensive plan mode, and this is one chapter in this bigger document. And one of the things you said maybe 5 minutes ago that dealt with incentives to small businesses that may not have, like B-poll taxes that are significant because of what they are operating under, but they are bringing good jobs, and those are high salary jobs. But I'm intersecting that with what was for us, 2 chapters before this, which is our housing report and the problems that we have with housing, and the fact that a significant number of the upper middle class people with jobs in the city actually live in the county, and so we're actually losing, them to, some of those other parts of like the tax base, and so to me, it is an issue that we need to think about how these things cross tab with each other, and I didn't have a really well-articulated question to ask on that, which is part of why I was sitting on my hands. But I mean, like, you have worked in the state of Virginia, which has this issue of cities and counties. Do you have other examples of, the population base of jobs or high-paying jobs or whatever may be in the city, the college, Colonial Williamsburg, but we're not housing those workers, and we lose at I'm with the college. I mean, we lose a lot of the junior faculty, not as much anymore in the past few years, but over the decades, to either living in Richmond or Newport News Hampton because of those issues of partners and spouses and things like that. So to me, that interconnectivity is a piece that I would like to have seen a little bit more of, or maybe you could talk to it.
So it's all intertwined.
Right.
So housing and sense of place and healthcare, school systems, I mean, all of it is intertwined together. And it depends on the place that I've worked. Some places, for example, have people that leave their county every day, so they're net exporters of labor to a neighboring larger community for work, and they're more of a bedroom community. So their goal is to find jobs, to create jobs in the community for people that are out commuting. You already have a lot of in-commuters here, probably a lot of transition around. We did interview people, and they talked about living outside but working inside the city. One of the things I would encourage you to do is look at housing policy in other places and housing encouragement. We're seeing, I'm not sure this is happening in Virginia, we're seeing in other places actually incentives for housing developers in certain places. I don't know the effectiveness of that. The housing market in some places, the cost of construction is up, and it's very hard to find construction workers. And so there's many other things going on with the housing market, but I would look at housing policy. I don't know of any places in Virginia that are doing housing incentives, but there are in some other places. Several places in Virginia have done housing studies to look at where they have the largest gap, and they're taking that study information and marketing it to residential developers. So as a way to encourage development in certain housing price ranges and certain types of housing stock. But it is. But
we do have a housing study that's already been established as part of our comprehensive plan. And I guess part of my question was whether or not you actually saw that in what you were doing in terms of, I mean, so to me it's like if we have lots of different chapters all beating the same drum, then that provides a greater force to, bring it to City Council or get it in the next round of GIOs that we need to have. And I love this phrasing that you used, housing encouragement.
Yes, we did see that. So we actually talked with people who have started businesses and who work in this area, but they live outside the county because of the expense of housing. Is one issue. So we did talk with several people, business owners, and it is an issue. So I'll say yes is the short answer.
And it's an issue not only for the people who potentially have the incomes to buy the housing that's in the city, but for the businesses who potentially have lower paid jobs and they're having to import people because they can't live in the city for housing costs, and how that affects their workforce population.
One of the things we did not do, but I will go back and do, is you can look at commuting information and associate that with wage and age. So, for example, I've done that in some communities, and we just finished working in Pinehurst, North Carolina, for example, another large tourism-based population. So we found there that their in-commuters were younger and made less money than their out-commuters. So their out-commuters, they live in Pinehurst, they go to work in Raleigh. So we were able to look at those commuting patterns associated with industry sector and wages and to get a deeper picture of what's happening. We'll be glad to do that here, but that we haven't yet, but I'll go back to that research.
And I had a thought about that in terms of a land use policy and directly with the comp plan. So I know in my office, and I think Carolyn would agree, we often get inquiries about people who want to do affordable housing. And they usually want to do it right on the commercial corridor. And our policy has been, and I don't know if y'all have discussed this as a planning commission, but our policy has been to save that land for the commercial base. Only 10% of our land is commercial, and we're very, what would be the word? Tight. We're particular about it. We want to keep it because we need a tax base, right? So
guard it jealously.
So I think that's, in terms of a planning commission lens, that land use factor of the importance of commercial land, we do allow a mixed-use development with a third commercial and two-thirds residential, but that has not been successful in some of our corridors either, so I'll just point that out.
Further questions or comments?
Just thinking a little bit further about the relationship, since we have these two bodies here together today, thinking a little bit further about this relationship that a number of people have asked about between long-term planning and land use and economic development. Maybe another way to come at this, because I think we're all asking a similar question, is to ask you for, since you've looked at a number of communities, some models, some other communities where that relationship has worked really, really well, whether it's two bodies or staff or whatever. Can you think of examples that we might look to for how to ensure that our interests are all in alignment? And I'll leave that sentence there.
You mean between the Planning Commission and the EDA?
Just between those functions generally. I mean, yes, here we have these two bodies that do this work, but these are two kind of different functions, both of which are essential for healthy communities. So what are some other healthy communities that you've looked at where those two operations work very, very well together? Take all the time you need.
Thinking. So where I've seen the greatest effort to align sustainability goals with general economic development goals are typically in cities that are a little bit larger than Williamsburg, maybe because they're just on a different continuum. But for example, Asheville, North Carolina would be a good example of one that a community that works very hard to align not just sustainability goals, but housing goals, redevelopment goals. They're very concerned with living wage standards, and many equity is very important to their economic development office. And so I would look to Asheville for several other reasons too. I mean, they are interested in public art as you are. They are supportive of their artist community. They have what they call innovation districts, which is an overlay of special tax district area that supports redevelopment of specific areas. They do have a tourism economy. They're larger than you, but they, in everything they do in economic development and planning in their whole city government is focused to this greater vision of sustainability in their community. So that would be a good example.
Great, thank you.
But I wouldn't say they move quickly on things.
So we share that as well.
Move quickly.
Nobody's perfect.
Because I always have something to say. I've worked in other localities in Virginia, and I think it's exceptional here how well the planning and economic development offices work together. I don't want to put those words in Carolyn's mouth, but I hope she feels the same because, frankly, it often is an antagonistic relationship. And I think we've built our economic development objectives as 5 things that Crystal talked about in the beginning have always pointed to the need to be a smart, planned community with high-quality infrastructure. And that's a key to our sense of place. And so economic development, I feel, is aligned through those objectives. So if we remain to be... Carolyn's nodding her head.
No, Michelle, I mean, when you said this, I mean, having served on the Planning Commission, but also as the Planning Commission's liaison to EDA, and so having worked with both staffs and all that, I mean, I think that we actually have a very smart, well-run city and want to be collaborative. I mean, I think from the Planning Commission perspective, this is one piece of a bigger picture, but if we don't have a, vibrant, downtown and jobs and a healthy community and the infrastructure to support that, then we don't have a community that we want. And, so we need to have those things work together.
And one area, and I think this is true because of the way the state of Virginia, our tax policy that comes from Richmond, and Crystal hit on this, is we do find ourselves in economic development chasing the retail meals tax and hotel taxes, because that's what pays our bills in Williamsburg.
Sure.
45% of our general fund is coming from those sources, and that is not aligned with
the greater community wanting higher wage jobs, and people living here with those opportunities. So those do come in conflict. And I would have to frankly say, at the end of the day, we spend more time on the meals and sales and room tax because that's paying the bills. And I think this plan is a step to start that conversation, that the other is just as important. It's harder to quantify. It's harder to make that tax incentive argument, but it's very important in how we live as a community.
I think this is an exciting time to get this report, because I agree with you that we have the right people in place, and we have both on the volunteer level and on the staff level. What's exciting about this is actually having a strategy. So you talked about the word business concierge. I think we have that mentality in the people that we have in place, and we haven't always had that reputation, but I think we're building that. It's built literally, business owner by business owner. But I don't think, have a strategy that views ourselves, both volunteers and staff, as concierge. And so if you codify that and say, what does that actually mean, and who's going to do what, we've definitely got the attitude and people in place. We just need to make a strategy out of it. And so that's why I think we have an opportunity.
And then market it.
Right.
So that your
Tell
customers know, and that says something about your eagerness to help them be successful here.
Without getting too far in the weeds on something you mentioned very early on, you mentioned that our staff, through the Jobs EQ program, has access to some of this data. In order to make a compelling case that the Planning Commission could look at to land use and strategic planning, and that the EPA could look at for incentive grants and come to City Council and talk about, would you recommend that we have whatever tool it is you use in addition to what Michelle has to broaden her access to data? Because I think if we want to make a case to City Council that some of the meals tax and hotel tax revenue that we get, instead of just incentivizing more hotels and more restaurants, might be reapplied to a grant program that meets less concrete revenue criteria, but nonetheless meets criteria that are defined. Mm-hmm. That's going to be a tricky needle to thread, and you need the best data you can so that she's not out there in the wind exposed saying, made a recommendation, but you were wrong. So I don't want to do that as to plan how we use the business zoned property that we have in the city, and I don't want to do that to the EDA. But if there's a program out there that you think makes that job easier or safer to predict, that would be helpful.
So I'm an economist by training, so I love econometric models. I just love them, and I love the data behind them, and I love all that. But here's what it does for you. And so the tool let me just say what it does for you first. So for example, as you're working on land use planning, you can take any particular piece of land and you could say, what if, it's what it's called in Jobs EQ, what if a 50-employee healthcare business located here, what's the impact? Then what if a business services center located here, what's the impact? What if this type of company located here? It gives you an idea of the varying economic impact of different sectors in your community, and that may be helpful to you in planning as a tool for planning. So you can use that what if software that may be helpful again in planning. Another way that that's helpful is when you're presented with a specific project and you're trying to figure out not only what is the direct benefit, but what is the indirect and induced, the multiplier benefit, if you will, and balance that with the investment that you're proposing to make in terms of an incentive. In some places, in some states, the governments actually require an economic impact model before any incentive is finalized so that the government can review its return. So there, you can use it for a specific project, you can use it for what-if scenarios, you can use it in reverse. We've actually modeled what happens if this company leaves. So that will give you an idea of the negative impact if a company was to leave. So the software you have now, it's already built into your license, and it provides some modeling for economic impact, and it does a good job. What I would say the gold standard for economic modeling in the U.S. is M-Plan modeling, and that would be a separate subscription. It's not difficult to learn the surface. You would need some additional training to really dive deep into it, but it allows you to do lots of different modeling types and comparisons and put together different regions to do it, and it's very sophisticated. But I think for the purposes that you're talking about for planning, I think with the what-if model you have would be a good place to start since you already have that program.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments? This has been good feedback, by the way. I appreciate it.
Well, I, for one, I know nothing about business or marketing, and your report was very enlightening, and thanks for your presentation, which further enlightened the report. I learned a lot.
Thank you. That's
I can
good.
use it.
Good. Thank you.
So thank you.
So one of the takeaways, Michelle, is that Yuri has a new title. She's now business concierge, and you might want to free up some time to train on a new program.
But yeah, when you came up with that the first time, the small business concierge, or in other contexts we see navigators, I mean, just really having some sort of a acknowledgement of this, because every time we see a business in front of us who has gone through months of working with staff at EDA and planning staff and all that, their first thing is to compliment the city staff and how they went out of their way over and over to make them have a really fantastic project that will then be approved. I mean, which is the get to yes position for them, right? But it's just really more our framing it that we are doing this because we were actually already doing it.
I do like the notion of the concierge as somebody who, from time to time, leases office space and retail space. People will say, so where do I go from here? And I will send them to the Economic Development Authority or the Planning Department. And usually they have a look in their face like, oh, great, I'm going to the government. They're really going to help me out here. And I try to convince them that we have a great department and that they want to help. But when you put a title like a business concierge to help you locate here, that really sets a marvelous tone for the businesses that are thinking about relocating from a neighbor or from a furthering jurisdiction. So I think that's a great idea.
Well, it seems to me, I was at the administrative building the other day, just Friday, and there was somebody who was actually doing that. There was somebody that was applying for a business license, and there was somebody with them, and I was there for another reason. I wasn't thinking in this context, but we may have somebody that's already doing that. I don't know who it was, but she said, they finished there and got the business license, and now you have to go upstairs, and, I wasn't eavesdropping, but I just heard a part of it. So we may have people that are actually functioning that way, and we just need to, focus that and reward them for doing it.
I think, James, you're exactly right. And it's not just economic development staff, it's planning, it's Commissioner of the Revenue, Finance Department. We're blessed in the city that everyone has that attitude. And one thing Yuri and I, when we read the first draft, we said, oh, we're doing this. We just need to give ourselves credit and use the name. So thank you. I'm glad you overheard some of that.
Other questions for Crystal?
We will go back and revise this report based on the feedback that we've gotten today, do the additional research that we need, and then we'll work with staff to finalize the report and then have a final report ready for EDA.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your feedback. I appreciate it.
So returning to our agenda, I think we have merged in large part the presentation and the next piece, which was discussion, but having allowed Crystal to get off her feet finally, sorry to have been on your feet for so long, are there any other points of discussion that either board would like to add at this point?
I can add a quick one. It was part comment, part discussion point, but I'm just very excited about the idea of sort of rebranding Williamsburg and pushing the idea of an entrepreneurship center. It took me back to the video in the presentation made in Henderson County, and it's a bit in comparison to Williamsburg, dramatized for what we might see, but it's middle schoolers saying, here's what we think manufacturers are, and then actual manufacturers saying, here's what we really are. You know, I have a great job. I do different things every day. I'm always working with my friends. So I think sort of changing that to make students, at least at William & Mary or the high schools around, or who are off at other colleges coming back, seeing here's a budding entrepreneurial hub, that would be really, really good for the community.
Yeah, and I think with regard to the centers, broadly writ, because at William & Mary they come with lots of different titles. I think thinking about that broad, you know, in a broad basket, or a broad umbrella or whatever is the analogy there, because in my department at William & Mary there's a center, at David's department, it is a center as a whole. So, I mean, in parts beyond the business school, but in arts and sciences, in the ed school and the law school, I mean, we have lots of different centers that really resonate to our community, like the Veterans Benefits Center, or the Center for Excellence in Aging and Geriatric Health, or the Healthcare Foundation of the Global Research Institute. So, I mean, there's lots of other places that are centers that are at William & Mary and that are connected with the community as well. So I think whoever does that cataloging needs to be thought of a little bit more broadly than just the business school.
I'll just add a third from the William & Mary for the pile-on, but I think it's interesting with the kind of the Amazon internship program, the MOU, that the legislature is currently considering. There's a significant play for higher education to invest in data science, and there's internship program, and I see Michelle nodding, so I'm glad that we're tracking this, but there's significant tens of millions of dollars going to come out of Richmond to different parts of the state, and with a particular emphasis on non-Northern Virginia, and thinking about how you align that with institutions of higher learning. So again, it's the entrepreneurship, it's a center. We're looking at a window in the next, probably this fiscal year, next 2 to 4 years with this new revenue coming on board, in which there's going to be path dependencies of where the money is going to flow. So if we can be part of that conversation in the next couple of years, that's going to determine the next decade or 2 decades of where those resources from the Amazon investment will come. And we do have some advantages, even though people don't normally think of us as part of that conversation, but we should be.
And I think your new president at the college is a great one to lead in that and in entrepreneurship, both those areas.
Take the opportunity to take a stab at the partial answer to Adam's question, which is what can we do together? And one of the things I hope you would consider to include in your long-term plan, one is an incentive for revitalizing, considered in your workforce housing, but an economic incentive to revitalize hotels and motels that are not successful into workforce housing. So we have a model for that in the city, but I think it was done largely without economic incentive, and but it had to go through Planning Commission, and that was sort of a pioneer. I think there were a lot of lessons learned in that. But again, it goes to what is the use of these properties along our corridor if they are hotels/motels that are no longer producing room tax because they're being used legally for long-term stays now. Can we come alongside some of those properties through changes in the zoning and in the planning regulations? And can we come alongside them from an EDA point of view and actually provide a tax incentive the way we've done with new restaurants coming to the area to change those into providing workforce housing? On page 20 of the report, key occupations, we're talking about hotel, motel, resort clerks, waitresses, maids, cooks, travel agents, bartenders. Those people, the ideal situation is that they are not commuting from Gloucester because they can't afford to live here. The ideal solution is actually that they walk to work.
Right.
And so if we can creatively inspire owners of these properties to invest in them, stop calling them failed hotels and start calling them attractive workforce or short-term housing, whether it's for J1 students, whether it's for high school students coming back, or whether it's for workforce that we already have, That's something that would require both boards to work from an economic incentive, provide tax incentives for them to do that. And it may be tax incentives out of future revenue, but it's finally admitting among everybody that what we're doing now is not working, which is hoping that they throw a couple dollars through us to ruin meals tax when these people are not guests, they're residents. That's one. The other is, we talked about density, and it's already happening, but it would happen quicker and perhaps better if we also could provide a tax incentive to rehabilitate older houses in the city. Some that are historic and some that are not. They're just old. They're not historical. But provide a tax incentive for people to renovate those houses as long as it was not used for student housing. So one of the challenges we've faced is the economics of homes that are close to the college right now strongly favor using them for student residents. I think that'll be the case even when we have. So we've got to counteract that incentive by perhaps providing incentive, not taxing for some period of time, the improvements that a homeowner makes in a property. That benefits everyone. It's going to benefit our business community. It's also going to benefit tax base eventually for the whole city. So you may already be considering those, but those are two things that I thought of us can work together on, because it involves tax policy, it involves zoning, it involves, quite frankly, we'd have to have a buy-in from the ARB as well, because talk about business concierge, that's probably the area of most friction that business owners and residents are facing. Property. We want to have...
That's part of the planning department, so that's all part of us as well. Yeah.
But if we want to have more, and it's happening, I know 3 long-term business owners in Williamsburg have lived in the county who are bought homes in the city because they want to be walking distance. They're putting, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of dollars of money back into these properties, which is exactly what we want. But we may need a concierge, and Carolyn does a phenomenal job of this already, but just walking through the process. But maybe we want to throw some money in terms of foregone revenue from that to make it attractive vis-a-vis college students. So those were 2 thoughts I had on one end of the spectrum, which is the people who really are precariously housed and precariously working who need help. And on the other end is encouraging more people, those professionals who are now, you described, exiting to go to work to other parts, to move back downtown and live downtown. That provides the vitality that I think we're seeking.
Yeah, so I guess I had one to amplify your comment, but then I had a question about one part of what you said. So when Crystal brought up housing encouragement, I see that as part of the bigger picture that we have, that we're trying to grapple with, frankly, in terms of what you do to encourage people, families, individuals to buy houses downtown, to rehab the old houses that are not necessarily historic, but they've just been around since the 50s or 40s or 30s, as mine is. And it needs renovation that is in the 6 figures every period of time, frankly. But you started it off using the term density, and I didn't know whether you were also going to brook over towards an idea of allowing some of those houses to be rehabbed in a way that they became like duplexes or something like that, because nothing brought me back to density with the rest of your comments. So where were you thinking when you were thinking about density there?
There's some infill that we could encourage and could allow. There's empty lots that could be considered, again, for incentive for people to put housing if we try to carefully incent ownership of those houses. Really what I mean is more people living downtown, working downtown, whether they be at the college or in some private enterprise, that is, I think, already generating success for our new restaurants and businesses. But really jumping behind that was a fantastic example. couple, they're both school teachers, house, Scotland Street, and I'm sorry, they were really helped by Carol in the planning office in walking that through. That's their life investment is in that property.
Sure.
But that's a great example of capturing a property, having a really town that's now spending most of their money. So if we can get behind that phenomenon, which I believe is already happening, with a business concierge, with a housing concierge, planning and ARB policy, with perhaps some tax incentives, particularly on the housing, really come behind, and we had a hope we've accelerated a phenomenon that's already happening and take advantage of the strengths that we already have.
In regards to the density, I think some accessory uses for mother-in-law suites and garage apartments are a great option for young families that might be starting off, young couples, the business person who's just graduated from college and wants to do something like that. I think that's a great opportunity, and I think they're hard to find, and it would be nice to see them at least in the homes where there's an owner who lives there, and then there's an accessory apartment that's available to be leased out. I think that's a great opportunity, and my understanding and impression is that they're not allowed in often at all. So
I think that's a really good point, and sort of one where there's then sort of this double edge in a positive way, if you will, to home ownership and affordability in the city. As a homeowner, you could buy and add an accessory dwelling or renovate something that could legally or maybe should legally be allowed as an accessory dwelling. And now you've also got, affordable housing, like you said, for people that are looking to live in a mother-in-law suite or a garage apartment. And so I think that would be a great conversation for us to have as the Planning Commission.
And I think that, anecdotally, this behavior happens in the communities, but as they are not necessarily legal, I think that if they were legal, that people might be willing to invest more into making them a more proper small housing unit. There was a great article in the Wall Street Journal in the past month in their real estate section about communities in California where housing is so expensive, where property is so expensive, renovating or changing their rules on doing these things. And a lot of people, they had several examples of people who were living in the quote-unquote the proper home, but built a really nice, what appeared to be a dependency building that matched the style of the main home that they were planning on renting out in the short run while their children were growing up, but then they planned to move into that and rent out the proper home later on. So they built a really nice accessory building. It wasn't, this low-end thing. And I think that there are a good number of folks who are living in their quote-unquote primary home right now, but when they get a little bit older, they might want something smaller, something that's a little bit more user-friendly in their later years. Not ancient later years, but later years that I might be wanting to be there soon. That you would be willing to invest in that kind of accessory building, knowing how it's going to be used by a small family or a couple now, eventually maybe you and your spouse or partner later on, kind of thing. But yes, I think that those are innovative ways to be thinking about.
While we have this group together, I think it might be useful just to get Carolyn to weigh in, get some feedback from her on the degree to which there are obstacles to, as we reconsider the comprehensive plan, to accessory dwelling units and motel or hotel conversion in the current comprehensive plan, and what how difficult you anticipate overcoming those obstacles might be as we move forward with the comprehensive plan.
One of the main obstacles we have is we can't regulate who owns the piece of property and say that you have to live in one unit or the other. That's one of the main obstacles I think we face in the state of Virginia. That we can't put a requirement that says you have to be owner occupied to have the unit in the back.
Oh.
So that's one of the questions you were having, which makes
Right.
sense, and you can do that in some of the other areas because they're home rule states, and they would
Right.
give you the authority to do that. But in Virginia, you have a
City
right
can't
to
do
own
that.
a piece of property, and you have a right to rent that piece of property.
Yeah.
So that's one of the obstacles I think that we have in Williamsburg to be able to do that.
In other words,
We
the risk.
currently allow an accessory structure for a mother-in-law or someone with disabilities. You go to the Board of Zoning Appeals, you have a certain square footage requirement that you can have and do that type of use. We also have in the ordinance the one where the state code just recently changed 2 or 3 years ago, where you can have an accessory building in the back of the property for, say, a parent and so forth. No one's used that section yet in the code, but I think there's quite a few limitations when you're trying to regulate that it has to be an owner on the piece of property in order to get these other uses. That's something we can talk to Chris about, but
Yeah.
that's
Sounds like something we
one
need
of
to
the
keep
obstacles
talking
for
about,
us.
though.
Yeah.
Because I hear something approaching consensus.
And I think currently we have 150 units that are allowed in the B2 district where you can switch the hotel units to workforce
R1
housing
or R3
type
or whatever.
units. And we've had, of course, one property owner who's used up 100 of those units. We have
Oh,
not
that's
had a
right.
taker come in and
Right.
take the other 50 units yet.
Right.
But I think there's one in the works that you'll probably see in sometime this spring for the other 50 units.
That's right. I forgot we put a cap on that.
Right.
Was that with the intention of being able to revisit and see
Yes,
how it works?
yes,
and be able
yes.
to come back to it? Okay.
Right, so when the proposal first came forward, we had a cap of like 100, 50 were taken at the first round of that proposal. That proposal was then modified, that was going to take like 80, 90 of that 100, so we modified it, bumped it out a little bit, so there was potential for another proposal to come forward. Nothing else has come forward at this point. But with the idea of the property rights that are established by the state of Virginia, I mean, we do have, with the idea of this housing encouragement or other kinds of incentives, when you engage in an incentive, you turn over some of those rights because, that's sort of overlay. So like when Wales was developed with the Community Development Block Grant, I mean, the initial purchasers of that had to be owner occupied for a certain amount of time. And in the past couple of years, just driving on Strawberry Plains, that annotation of a development by the Williamsburg Housing Development Authority has been covered over because I guess enough time has gone by that now people can and sell it again to somebody who potentially may not be living there, might rent it. So, I mean, there was this like 10-year, 15-year horizon that provided the incentive, but then also the control. So, I mean, part of these incentives that we could imagine could also, you're voluntarily giving up some of your per se rights of your property. Right. So that's something that is a potential, is that not?
And I know the cities also, we're looking at the Neighborhood Balance Committee. We're also looking at the Housing Committee as part of the council goals. So you'll start seeing staff develop committees for that. And there will be, of course, I think, EDA members and Planning Commission members and other boards and commissions throughout the city that will be on those boards to start looking at these tougher issues and look at examples not only in the state but other areas on how we can incentivize possibly home ownership and how we can get workforce housing at a reasonable cost. I mean, part of the issue is the cost of the property is high.
Right.
The cost of renovating those older hotels into affordable units is not cheap.
Yes.
So you still end up with a product that in some areas is probably $400 or $500, but in the city of Williamsburg, when you go through those renovation costs, you have to have a rent of $700 to $1,000 for that unit. And is that really affordable for a one-bedroom efficiency type unit? So, I mean, that's what we're up against, is that it's not cheap to, one, buy the property in the city, two, to renovate the property and end up with a product that is affordable to a bartender or a waitress or those individuals that we want to live in the city and be able to walk to their work, but they're having to live in Hampton or Newport News or another jurisdiction and having to take either drive or take the bus system, which sometimes takes them an hour and a half to get here each direction. So
although as we get more experience with these, I presume we'll be able to solve this math problem a little more,
right.
More readily. Maybe make the math a little bit more favorable.
And that's what I think these committees and starting up looking at these tough issues is that we're going to look at other jurisdictions and see how they reach that goal and what incentives or tax breaks or those other things that they did to help get people to reinvest into these properties.
I think also, just one last thing, I think also really important in thinking through this problem is collecting more of this data. I've forgotten, Crystal, the phrase that you used, but the specific data about how many people and at what wage are commuting out of the city and how many people and at what wage are commuting back into the city, and how do we minimize the degree to which we're forcing people to move away in order to work in these fundamental industries, food service and hospitality, that aren't the $150,000 a year jobs. These are $15 an hour jobs. So better data about that, I think, will allow us to say, these are the price points we need to hit. Where are some opportunities for us to kind of hit these rent points, and how do we put the pieces together? And I don't think it's an impossible problem to solve. I think we've heard some good thoughts about ways to approach the problem here. But I think some better data, some really good data about just exactly what the problem is and where we can solve it easily will start to help us think about priorities, I guess.
And what price point really solves the issue for that worker to stay here?
Right.
Is it 4 to 6 range, or is it the 6 to 8 range, whatever that range is? And once you know that price point, I think then you can try to get your strategies on how you get to solve that issue.
Yeah.
How do you do it?
Without buying those properties, which we have also done, demolishing and hope that somebody does it, really, as these two bodies, we only have two ways. One is to remove the regulatory obstacles to make it possible to do that, and the second is to make it more financially feasible by either providing financing, attractive financing, or tax incentives. So, I mean, those are fairly blunt instruments, but those are the ones that we have to deal with. So I hope we don't study it for another 5 years. I hope that we try, I love let's do 100 or 150 and see how it goes. That's the kind of entrepreneurial spirit that'll get it done, but it's okay if we don't get it right on every one, but it's, in my view, not okay just to hope that it happens.
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
And what would be lovely to have is actually some measure of what I think about the multiplier effects of having your staff be able to live in the community that they work in, because then they don't have to spend 3 hours commuting. They're going to be more productive members of your staff. Their absenteeism will go down, and they're going to be more cheerful as they, meet the public on your behalf. I mean, that's a huge multiplier effect. I mean, of everyone on your staff, including the gardener, is part of your welcoming committee to anyone who comes to your business or your college, for me, and all that. And if they're already disgruntled because of how they had to even get to work that morning, that is a major disincentive to your first line of presentation.
The other disincentive was that we didn't want to do it because we had to pay for their kids. It's $10,000 per kid if they moved here and brought their children with them to educate them. Yeah. And so I think as a community we have to decide whether that's worth it or not. But that was the reason we haven't done it in the past, is we didn't want to pay for their kids to have be educated. And I think we have to decide whether that's something that we want to continue, or whether we want to understand that we're absorbing that.
I would say for the property that was renovated, I don't think that property has many school kids at all.
Can we get any data on how many kids are in
I have the data on where kids are by neighborhood.
Okay.
Yeah, we know where the school buses go. Yeah, Rob?
Well, I think an interesting case study on density and affordability could potentially be Midtown Row to start, because I know as a business owner that none of my team, my staff live within the city limits, to my knowledge, myself being the one exception. And we obviously do our best to pay fair wages, but part of it is just the opportunities to live in the city, whether you're a renter or a buyer. Midtown Row, I know at least from the onset, the developers had talked about trying to come up with some different affordable living options that might be attractive to college students, but also might be attractive to those who are recently out of college or those who are kind of working towards purchasing at a future date. And so I don't know if that's still going to take place in part or in full with some of the apartments that they're planning to construct, but it'll be interesting to see if they're able to drop some of the price points based on some of those plans, because I know the newer developments that are rentals for apartments or townhomes have not generally been affordable to the point where I was living, my mortgage now is not that much more expensive than the rent I was paying in my apartment complex when I first moved back to Williamsburg. And even one of our staff members left Newtown and now lives in Richmond and commutes and claims that he's still saving money in the grand scheme of things, even with the addition of the gas and the travel time. So I'd love to see if Midtown Row can come through and at least provide something of a more affordable and more approachable nature that would then lead to maybe others being able to follow suit, whether it's at that scale or much smaller scales.
Other points of discussion? Okay, well, this is a public meeting, and our next item on our agenda is an open forum, so I will open the floor to anyone else who might wish to come forward and speak to either Planning Commission or EDA on this or other topics that are before us. Having done my duty to open the floor, I will say that no one is coming forward, so we will close that. Which brings us to the end of our agenda. And so if there are no other points of business for anyone, I will ask that Heather adjourn us with a roll call of Planning Commission.
Mr. Boswell?
Yes, here.
Mr. Klee?
Here.
Beth?
Here.
Mr. Edwards?
Here.
Fowler?
Here.
Mr. Rogers?
Here.
Mr. Granger?
Heather, could you repeat the process for the Economic Development Authority, please?
Mr. Steely? Mr. Overy? Mr. Tritchler? Mr. Hale?
Here.
Mr. Carr? Mr. Wiley?
Okay, just for an update for other folks who might be interested in this, the Planning Commission has another Wednesday meeting next Wednesday, also at 4 o'clock, where we will be looking at the CIP, the Capital Improvement Plan. And we are over. Thank you.